A gramophone played, and announced death before anyone spoke a word. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallo. Comment below. Where are you listening from? Your voices make this more than a story. They make it ours. If you had asked me to name the most curious case Hercule Poirot ever involved himself in, I might have hesitated, for there have been many, each with its own particular peculiarity. Yet the business at Hawthorne Grange stands apart, not for the method of murder, but for the manner in which the death was announced. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early March when I first heard of it. Poirot and I were returning from a most satisfactory luncheon at a small Belgian café he had lately discovered in Kensington. He had been in high good humour, expounding at length upon the superiority of the chef's sauce béarnaise, and lamenting, with mock tragedy, the English tendency to drown all good things in brown gravy, when a small green Morris pulled sharply to the curb beside us. Out stepped Inspector Japp, his expression more harassed than usual. "Ah, my dear Japp," cried Poirot, sweeping forward like a man greeting an old friend on a Paris boulevard. You arrive with the suddenness of the deus ex machina in the third act of a melodrama. Do you bring tidings of drama also? Japp ignored the jibe. It's a strange one, Poirot. A call from the countryside, Surrey way. Old Sir Charles Hawthorne's been found dead in his drawing-room. Heart failure, the doctor thinks, but... He paused. Well, the thing is, the way they found out about it is... odd. Odd? Poirot's eyes sharpened at once. According to the butler, the family was all gathered in the drawing-room after dinner last night, and Sir Charles excused himself early. Half an hour later, the gramophone started up in the study next door. They thought nothing of it, until it began to speak. To speak? I repeated. Not music, said Japp, but Sir Charles's own voice, recorded on a blank disc, calm as you please, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, by the time you hear this, I shall be dead." There was a short silence. Poirot's eyes half closed, his head tilting at that precise angle I knew meant his mind was already racing ahead of us. And when they rushed in, he asked quietly. They found him in his armchair, stone dead. Doctor says it could have been his heart, but the son swears his father was in perfect health. And the gramophone disc, well, that's the thing. No one admits to knowing how it was recorded, or why. Poirot gave a small, satisfied murmur, like a cat that has found cream in the pantry. And there were, naturellement, other persons present in the house? Just the family and a couple of house guests. Son, daughter-in-law, spinster aunt, family friend, and the secretary, plus the servants. Tight little group, no outsiders. Poirot's moustaches twitched upward. A closed circle, mon ami. Already I am intrigued. But tell me, what do you think, Japp? Japp grimaced. Could be suicide. Could be one of 'em set the thing up to frighten someone, or hide something. But I'll tell you this, it's going to be awkward as anything to prove either way. The place is crawling with alibis. Alibis, Poirot repeated softly. They are often like the gramophone record, mon cher, playing the tune one wishes others to hear, but not necessarily the true music. Within the hour, we were on the train to Surrey. Hawthorne Grange stood alone on a rise above the village, a house of grey stone and stern lines. The March wind worried at the ivy on its walls, and the great windows stared out like unblinking eyes. The butler, an elderly man named Graves, met us at the door and conducted us through a high-ceilinged hall where the scent of wood polish hung in the air. The family were assembled in the drawing-room, 5 figures arranged as if for a formal photograph. At once I noted their careful stillness, the faint air of hostility beneath the politeness. Lady Hawthorne, tall and thin, with hair drawn back severely, sat nearest the fire, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Beside her, Richard Hawthorne, the son, was a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 40, with a jaw that suggested obstinacy. His wife, Celia, a pale, elegant woman, sat slightly apart, gazing down at the rug. The spinster aunt, Miss Lydia Hawthorne, was sharp-faced and wore an expression of perpetual disapproval. And finally, there was a younger man, introduced as Mr. Simon Vale, the family's guest, a literary type with an untidy tie and restless eyes. The introductions were stiff, formal. Poirot, with his unfailing courtesy, made a few polite remarks before turning to the matter at hand. Messieurs et Mesdames, you have suffered a shock, yet it is necessary that I understand the events precisely as they occurred. You will be so good as to describe, each in turn, what happened last evening after Sir Charles retired. Lady Hawthorne's voice, when it came, was cool and measured. Charles said he was tired. He left us at 8:30. At 9 o'clock precisely, we heard the gramophone start in the study. We thought it odd. Charles rarely played music. But then his voice began, announcing his death. Richard went in at once and... She stopped, the memory tightening her features. He was gone. As she spoke, I glanced at Poirot. He was not watching her, but the others. And though his face was composed, I could see it in his eyes. The little grey cells were already at work. Graves, with the grave tact of his kind, withdrew to fetch tea, and in the small hush that followed, I could hear the wind worry at a loose casement above. Poirot remained standing a moment, making himself very small and very polite, and in that stillness I had the impression he placed each person where he wished them to be in his mind, like pieces on a chessboard he had already studied. Then he sat, delicately, on the edge of a chair that might have resented a heavier presence, and folded his hands. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I am exact. It is the only method that satisfies my love of the order." He smiled, one of those small, reassuring smiles that seems to warm a room without adding heat. "Lady Hawthorne, you say it was 9 o'clock precisely when the gramophone began?" Her eyes, a cool grey, met his. "Yes." Miss Lydia's mouth pinched. "It was a few seconds after 9. The long case in the hall began to chime as the record started. I dislike imprecision." "But of course," said Poirot, inclining his head. "Then we have the 9 hours marked by the English cathedral within your hallway. Ding-dong, while the voice of Sir Charles speaks. Monsieur Richard, you went at once to the study?" Richard rubbed at his temple with an impatient gesture. "Yes, I pushed the door open. He kept it only half shut when he was in there, and found him in his armchair by the fire, head tilted back. I thought, good God, I thought it was a stupid joke. And then—" He stopped. The big man swallowed and looked away. Celia's hands, slender and nervous, tightened on the arm of her chair. "The needle ticked at the end of the groove," she said in a soft voice. "A horrid little noise like a beetle." "You noticed the needle," Poirot murmured. "A detail. They are most precious, the details." He turned, almost idly, to Simon Vale. "Monsieur Vale?" The young man shifted. There isn't much to add. We all ran in. Graves came too. Lady Hawthorne sent for the doctor. That's all." "Pardon, not all." Poirot's eyes had the sudden quick light I knew well. "Yesterday, before dinner, how passed the day in this house? There was a visitor, a letter, an occurrence trivial perhaps, but which last night gave birth to the comment dit on drama." Lady Hawthorne's lips thinned. "There was no visitor. Charles went into the village in the afternoon. He returned in time to change. And he was, how do you say, of good spirits." "I would not call him merry," said Miss Lydia, dry as thistle. "He was occupied. He was often occupied. The estate accounts—" She broke off with a small sniff. "He was too indulgent with some of the tenants." Richard shot his aunt an annoyed glance. "Father knew what he was doing." "Just so," said Poirot, unruffled. "And there is also the secretary, n'est-ce pas? Monsieur—" "Reed," Celia supplied. "Alan Reed. He has taken ill this morning. A headache." "How afflicting," murmured Poirot. "We will not disturb him yet." Graves returned with the tea, borne on a tray polished enough to show a distorted assembly of us all. While he set it down, Poirot's eyes moved. No, wandered is too casual a word. They placed themselves over the mantel, the reading table, the padding on the arms of the nearest chair, where a faint feathering of ash spoke of a cigarette laid there by habit. He accepted a cup, added precisely 1 lump of sugar, and waited as though the steam might arrange itself more symmetrically under his gaze. When Sir Charles's voice was heard, he said at last, conversationally, "What did it say, exactly?" "It began with a remark about there being things a man does not say in life," Richard answered. "Then, by the time you hear this, I shall be dead." And something about apologies, and that he had his reasons. It cut off when I went in. The needle, a scratch, then the end. Celia's eyes flicked towards her husband. He didn't apologize. Not really. It was cold, like something written down and recited. That's what made it so awful. Poirot regarded her kindly. "You have a good ear, madame. And you, mademoiselle," he turned to Miss Lydia. "Do you recall the words with the same exactitude?" "Better, I dare say," she returned, pursing. He said, "By the time you hear this, I shall be dead. It is an unavoidable necessity." Then there was a pause, and he, "Oh, why quibble? He is dead." "Alas, yes." Poirot put down his cup. "I should like to see the study. It will not fatigue you, Lady Hawthorne, if we intrude a little." She rose immediately with a sort of chilly hospitality. Richard took a breath that was almost relief. We crossed the hall, and a small dagger of wind slipped down from above, as someone's careless window allowed it. In the study, the air was warmer, close with the faint sweetness of last night's smoke, and a ghost of lavender polish. Sir Charles's armchair, low and well-worn, faced the fireplace. A small table with a decanter and 2 glasses sat to the right. To the left, an oak writing desk of the sort with numerous shallow drawers and pigeonholes. The gramophone stood near the far wall, its horn a handsome black lacquer, the turntable still, the record upon it dull and unassuming. Above the mantel-shelf, a hunting print, 3 riders taking a hedge, hung a fraction crooked. Poirot, who notices crookedness the way other men notice beauty, went straight to the print and righted it by the smallest degree. "Voilà," he murmured. "C'est mieux." He peered into the armchair without touching it, bent his head over the hearth-rug, where a faint scuff made an irregular crescent in the pile, and then drifted to the gramophone. His hands remained behind his back. Only his eyes did the touching. "It is wound," he said. "Someone made it ready again." Richard flushed. After the doctor came and went, and the police, and they took him away, I put the lever back. It seemed indecent to leave it as it was." "And the record? This is the same?" "Yes," said Simon Vale quickly. "It's the one that played. We didn't touch it until the constable removed it to look at the label, and then he placed it back. I saw him." Poirot bent closer, and I saw what he saw. The label was plain cream, no printed title, only in small, neat handwriting the word aria, and beneath it, pencil lightly rubbed away. The ghost of other letters trembled there, indeterminate. "Curious," he said softly. "One writes upon a label once, puis one changes one's mind. Monsieur Hastings, observe the edge. There is the faintest nick, as from fingers that grip with the impatience, and the needle, there is the second point here in the rest. Bent. Someone lowered the arm a little carelessly." Miss Lydia made a disapproving sound. "Graves is usually meticulous." "Graves," said Poirot reflectively. "It is true that the servants, they handle the things, but it is the family that makes the mess." He moved to the small table. "2 glasses," he observed. "Were there 2 last night?" "I poured myself one after," Richard said shortly. "I needed something." "Bien sûr." Poirot stooped, then straightened. his nostrils faintly pinching. A scent, verbena. Lady Hawthorne wears it? Celia looked up, startled. I do, just a little. I was here last night after— Of course I was. Of course. Poirot's tone was good-humoured. He stepped to the desk, looked over the neat blotter, the stacked correspondence. You have the order here, he murmured approvingly. Bills to be paid, letters to be answered. Ah, and here the household accounts, the rents. The mind that arranges these is a tidy mind, and yet— He paused, eyes narrowing at a tiny smear near the right-hand drawer. Grease, perhaps. Graphite, or a little oil. Father kept his gramophone needles in that drawer, Richard volunteered, and then, with a frown, at least he used to, Reed reorganized things when he came. Alan Reed reorganizes. Poirot filed this away with a nod. He turned to the hearth. The fire had been made up in the morning. Beneath the ash, I saw the faint rectangle of something that had not burned evenly. Poirot did not stir it, only looked until the look satisfied him. Then he went back to the gramophone, and with a tender gesture set the brake and allowed the turntable to revolve once, twice, noiselessly. You have here the machine of the wind, he said lightly. It is not electric? No, said Simon. Sir Charles liked the old one, said it had character. Eh bien, Poirot murmured. A machine with character can be set, can be prepared, but it cannot be commanded to begin at 9 hours precisely without a hand, unless a little trick, how do you say, of toothpick and thread, of brake notched and freed, or of servant instructed. There are ways. Yet, he raised a finger. Listen to the psychology. A man who intends the death, who arranges the message, does he rely on the chance of 9 o'clock exactly, or does he desire the effect of 9? He left the question in the air, and when no one took it down, he turned a different way. Tell me, Lady Hawthorne, your husband, did he suffer from the heart? No, she said at once. He was robust. Richard hesitated. He had pills, tonics. Reed fetched them once a month. Miss Lydia sniffed again. Nonsense. Any gentleman keeps tonics. Men are vain about their energy. Celia's voice came, unexpectedly clear. He was frightened last week, just a little. He told me he was tired of quarrels. Quarrels? Poirot's head inclined. There has been some discussion, Richard said, with the tone of a man closing a door firmly. About the estate, about London. Vale has a play he wants to mount, and father had been, investing. Aunt disapproved. There were words. It's all perfectly ordinary. Perfectly, said Miss Lydia, icy. Throwing money at theatricals is ordinary now. Simon flushed to the roots of his hair. Sir Charles believed in art. And in the secretary? Poirot asked, as if he had not heard. He believed in him also? Reed is efficient, said Lady Hawthorne. He keeps the accounts impeccably. And recorded dictations for Sir Charles, added Simon, almost defiantly. If you want to know how the voice got on the record, there's your answer. He took down notes on a phonograph cylinder last month. Sir Charles was amusing himself with modernity. There's nothing mysterious about it. Nothing, Poirot agreed mildly. It is only strange that no one mentioned it until now. Celia's gaze dropped. We were all— last night was— one forgets half of what one knows. Poirot's face softened. Just so. He turned to the door, looked at the brass handle, then at the carpet between the chair and the gramophone, measuring something with his eye. And when you all ran in, who touched what? I touched the armchair, Richard said. Celia switched off the gramophone. I did not, Celia said, quick as a spring. I stood in the doorway. It was Lady Hawthorne. Lady Hawthorne coolly. If I did, I do not recall. Miss Lydia made a small, triumphant sound. Exactly so. None of you had your wits about you. I told Graves not to allow anyone to blunder, but it was too late. Poirot lifted his hand. We do not scold the past. It is too stubborn to learn. One last thing. You all dined together? We did, said Lady Hawthorne. At 8? 7:30, Graves supplied from the threshold, a little startled to be addressed. Roast capon, sir. Merci, Graves. And Sir Charles left at 8:30. So I said, Lady Hawthorne returned. Drank his coffee in here, I presume. Did Sir Charles drink coffee? Asked Poirot, a touch idly. Never after 6, Miss Lydia snapped. It disturbed his sleep. A silence followed, not long, but of a kind that fills the mind with little moving thoughts. Poirot looked down at the table with its 2 glasses, and then at the coffee cup on the mantel that no one had mentioned, because no one looks at what seems proper to be there. He did not touch it. He only allowed his eyes to rest until they were satisfied. Come, he said presently, genial again. We will not exhaust ourselves all at once. Mademoiselle Celia, perhaps later you will tell me of the quarrel about London. Monsieur Richard, you will indulge me with the accounts, only to admire the order, you understand. And I will see Monsieur Reed when his head consents. For the moment I would like, if it pleases, to hear each of you alone for the small 5 minutes. They returned one by one to the drawing-room, and he took them, one by one, with the patience of a clock. With Lady Hawthorne he spoke of years and habits. I noticed that she never said, my husband, only Sir Charles, and that when Poirot asked what he had feared, she replied, scandal, without asking which. With Richard he spoke of figures, and Richard, who had braced for accusation, relaxed and became almost boyish in describing rents and hedgerows. Only when Poirot asked who would inherit if Sir Charles had died last week and not next, he shut up like a slammed ledger. With Celia he spoke of London and loneliness, and she admitted in a whisper that there had been a plan to take a flat, away from the oppressions of the Grange, away from the aunt, and that Sir Charles had smiled and said, let us be sensible, which had not been a no and not been a yes. With Miss Lydia he discussed proprieties, and she betrayed that she had written a letter yesterday, very firm, to a woman in the village whom, so I gathered, Sir Charles had assisted beyond the aunt's idea of charity. And with Simon Vale he spoke of plays, and Simon's eyes shone and then darkened when Poirot put to him gently that men who depend on patrons sometimes hate them for the dependence. When they were done, the afternoon had shifted. A smear of late light lay across the carpet like the shadow of a harp. Poirot stood a moment at the window and then drew the curtains with a neat stroke. You have seen enough? I asked under my breath. For the beginning, he said. There is already the little contradiction, the small imposture, the lie told not to escape the justice, but to escape the embarrassment. I do not yet know whose it is. The coffee, I ventured. The coffee, the verbena, the record labelled once and labelled again. He smiled, and it was the smile he wears when he is amused by something that would alarm another man. And the sentence that is the falsest of all. What sentence? By the time you hear this, I shall be dead. He spread his hands. It is either the truth said simply, mon ami, or a trick made for the mind. But which? We were summoned then by Graves, who announced that Mr. Reed would see us if we wished. The headache had moderated under the influence of a dark draught and a darkened room. Poirot's eyes were very bright. He touched my sleeve. Come, Hastings. We will visit the young man who reorganizes. It is often the tidy person who notices what the others, in their muddle, would prefer not to exist. As we crossed the hall, I felt that the house had tightened about us, as if the grey stone itself desired that we not fail to understand its secrets. And in my mind, involuntarily, the words came again, that calm voice over the gramophone, and beneath it another sound, perhaps no more than the shiver of a bent needle, but which, in Poirot's hearing, I thought might be the first little crack in a very carefully arranged lie. Alan Reed's room lay at the end of a narrow passage on the first floor, the sort of corridor servants must have paced in earlier days, neat as a ledger line, and smelling faintly of beeswax and old books. Graves tapped, and a careful voice bade us enter. The man on the narrow bed was younger than I had imagined, 25 at most, clean-featured, pale, with the tidy stoop of those who make themselves smaller over a desk. A glass sat by the bedside with a dark liquid he had not quite drunk. A portable typewriter rested on a stand in the corner. Above it, a shelf of estate books and foolscap files, arranged with fanatical symmetry. "You are better?" Poirot asked in tones of solicitous domesticity one might use to a cat with a thorn in its paw. "It's easing, sir." Reed's eyes, behind rimless spectacles, were steady and intelligent. "A strain, that's all. But of course, the shock, it fatigues the nerves. We will not keep you long, Monsieur Reed. It is only that there are the small points of order and timing. You, who are the secretary of Sir Charles, you will know them as no other." Poirot drew a chair a precise inch closer and sat without creasing the bedspread. "Yesterday, if you please. The afternoon. The evening. I worked in the office from 2 until 6, Reed said at once, with the ease of a man who has rehearsed what he must say. Sir Charles had me copy the tenant ledgers, the winter remittances. He dictated 2 letters, one to a solicitor in town and one to a Mr. March of Hawley, about a boundary hedge. He went out at 4, returned by 6. We dined at 7:30. "He went out at 4, Poirot repeated, as if tasting the number. "He told you where?" "The village," he said, "to see the doctor about a tonic." "Ah, the tonic." Poirot's eyes glinted. "You fetched it sometimes, n'est-ce pas, in the past?" "I have, sir." Reed's fingers, very clean, very deft, adjusted the coverlet as if it were a sheet of paper, not quite square. "From Dr. Willoughby. There's nothing serious. Sir Charles disliked fuss." Poirot nodded, as if this confirmed something agreeable. "And the gramophone," he said lightly, as though speaking of the weather. "You are acquainted with its use?" Reed's look did not change. "I wind it for Lady Hawthorne sometimes, if Graves is busy." "Mais oui. And you have also, perhaps, used a machine for recording, the phonograph cylinder, that your friends in the drawing-room described to me. Sir Charles amused himself with dictation. He let the last word dangle, a baited hook. I showed him the Edison last month," Reed admitted. "It was my uncle's. Sir Charles dictated notes to himself. He liked to hear the sound afterwards, said it made nonsense feel final." "The cylinder," Poirot said, gentle as rain. "Not the disc." "The cylinder," Reed repeated. "Yet last night we hear the voice of Sir Charles from a disc." Poirot's head came a fraction to one side. "How was that arranged?" Reed's hand, the one that had smoothed the coverlet, paused for one breath. We made a disc on Tuesday afternoon." He swallowed and hurried on. "There's a recording attachment for the gramophone. Sir Charles bought it from London. It fits on the sound box. You speak into the horn, and the stylus cuts a groove in a blank lacquer. He wanted to leave a message for the family. For a party trick, he said. He drafted some words. We tried it twice." "In the afternoon," Poirot said, very soft. "Yes." "And yet," said Poirot, not altering his tone in the least, "Lady Hawthorne tells me Sir Charles went out in the afternoon. Miss Lydia confirms he was out. Monsieur Richard saw him return at 6. You say you were with him from 2 until 6, and made recordings together." The young man's pallor took on a faint, unbecoming flush. "I may be mistaken in the exact time. Perhaps it was the morning." "You are a tidy man, Monsieur Reed," Poirot murmured. "You do not mistake the hours easily, but it is of no importance." He smiled it away. "The words, you recall them?" "Something like, 'By the time you hear this, I shall be dead. It is unavoidable.' It sounded theatrical to me, sir. I said so. He told me not to be a prig." "We must never be priggish," Poirot agreed gravely. "And did he ask you to keep the disc ready upon the turntable? To set the brake in a little trick, to release at 9? He made with thumb and forefinger the tiniest movement, the ghost of a pinch. No. Reed's eyes held. He took the disc himself. He said he would surprise them after dinner. Bon. Poirot stood. You reorganized the desk, they tell me. I did. Sir Charles approved. I too approve of order, Poirot said. It is the only luxury that costs nothing and saves everything. One last curiosity. You wrote to the solicitor yesterday? Yes. Reed reached almost instinctively towards a case on the chair, checked himself and said, A covering letter for a draft settlement. Sir Charles had intended to make a provision. For whom? I don't know. Reed's mouth compressed. He kept that part in his own hand. Hand Poirot let that be. He looked instead at the glass beside the bed. You drink the draught, monsieur, but not all. The taste, it is bitter. Very. Like many truths. Poirot turned to go, then paused as if struck by a small domestic recollection. Ah, Monsieur Reed, forgive. When one makes the recording upon the disc, there is often a residue, the black dust, the shellac crumbs, the little filings of lacquer. Where did you empty them? In the wastebasket in the study, Reed said, and then quickly. But Graves would have cleared it by morning. Graves is admirable, Poirot agreed. Merci, monsieur. You have the kindness. In the corridor, I let out my breath. He is lying, I said, or at least evading. Not badly, Poirot returned, thoughtful. It is a little lie, perhaps given him to hold. But for whom? For the dead, or for the living? He walked on, very composed, and added, You heard the echo, how he corrected afternoon to morning, and then did not quite believe his rescue. The tidy men, they suffer when they must be imprecise. It leaves a burr. We went back down, and Poirot asked for the study wastebasket to be brought. Graves complied with a quiet alacrity. Within, beneath the ordinary detritus of letters torn in halves and the quills of pencil sharpenings, lay a fine sooty powder, adhered in crescents to the wicker. Poirot did not touch it. He bent and smelled gently, as if it were a bouquet. Lacquer. Also, a trace of camphor. You see, Hastings, we have the confirmation that a disc was cut in this room recently. Whether yesterday or last week, I cannot yet say. It doesn't prove murder, I said, because one must be practical. Non. He smiled sideways. It proves intention. That is often more dangerous. Lady Hawthorne's entrance checked further comment. She had recovered her composure to a high polish, and the polish reflected nothing. Mr. Poirot, I have had the blue bedroom prepared. Should you find it necessary to remain? You are all generosity, madame, he said with warmth that was not flattery. We accept with gratitude. For the trains, they are the enemies of the little grey cells after dark. Before I fatigue you further, one tiny question. The coffee cup upon the mantel. Who placed it there? She looked, and the tiniest line formed between her brows, as though a fly had alighted on an otherwise perfect cake. I don't know. We took coffee in the drawing-room. Sir Charles did not drink coffee after 6, Miss Lydia said from the doorway, pouncing upon the chance to be right. As I told you. Then this cup is a foreigner, Poirot said cheerfully. Graves? The butler, summoned by that tone which always carries to a butler's ear, presented himself. The cup, sir? Mr. Vale took coffee in the study before dinner, I believe. He was there with Sir Charles, going over his playbills. Simon flushed when we turned to him. I asked for it. Bad habit of mine. Sir Charles didn't take any. We spoke of an advance, that's all. At what hour? Asked Poirot. 10 to 7, Graves supplied, having the times of food in his bones. Dinner was a little delayed. Delayed? By whom? Poirot asked it, as though it were idle, a thread tossed to see who would catch it. By me, Celia said quietly. I mislaid a bracelet. It was foolish. I found it later on the escritoire in here. In the study? Poirot's gaze went, without haste, to the oak desk. You were in the study then, at 7:15? Only for a moment. Miss Lydia's eyes snapped like a trap. We were all flying about. It was confusion. This incessant interrogation. Poirot lifted a mild hand. I adore confusion, mademoiselle. It makes for clarity later. Monsieur Vale, you had the coffee and the advance at 10 to 7. Did you have also the argument? Simon's mouth opened, shut. It grew. Heated, he admitted. Sir Charles wanted changes. I told him they'd ruin the play. He said a man who asks for money must take advice with it. He gave a short laugh without pleasure. He could be brutal. He could be exact, Miss Lydia corrected. In exactitude, there is a kind of brutality, Poirot said, almost as if to himself. So, at 7:20, Madame Celia is here, in distress for her bracelet. At 7:30, you dine. At 8:30, Sir Charles retires to this room. At 9, his voice pronounces the doom. He drew the figures in the air, little knots upon a string. Between 8:30 and 9, who comes to this room? No one spoke. Very well, Poirot said. Let us suppose no one came. Then at 9 a machine begins without a hand, and a man who is not ill dies in his chair. Suppose instead that someone came. Then we must ask, did they come to watch the death, or to make the appearance of one? Richard bristled. You're suggesting father didn't die when we found him? I am suggesting nothing, Poirot answered, bland as cream. I am asking the time to tell me what it is. He moved without seeming to move, returning to the gramophone. With an elegant fingernail, he indicated the brake's little lever and the notch beside it, where wood had been abraded to a paler crescent. Hastings, you note. It is possible to set the brake so that a small tug, of thread, of wire, of falling weight, releases it. The long case clock chimes at 9. The vibrations, they are a thought. But I think a more human agency is less temperamental. See also here, caught it was, a hair, very fine. He pinched delicately and held up between finger and thumb a strand of pale gold, almost invisible until the light found it. Celia's hand went, involuntarily, to her temple. Poirot did not look at her. He let the hair drift, no more than a suggestion, back to the edge of the turntable, where it vanished into the ordinary dust. Graves, he said, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. May we have the village doctor's address? We will not disturb him until morning. Also, if there is a locksmith in the village, his name. A locksmith, I murmured, startled. The locks, Poirot said, smiling. One learns much from the locks. Who oils them, who neglects, who keeps a key that should be surrendered. He turned to Lady Hawthorne with a little bow. I beg 2 indulgences more. First, the loan of your husband's account books for an hour. Second, a look at his private safe. Lady Hawthorne hesitated, an admirable hesitation that weighed dignity against necessity, and found, with understandable reluctance, for the latter. Very well, Mr. Poirot. The safe is in his dressing-room. We followed her up a short stair. The dressing-room was austerely masculine, handsome and spare. The safe crouched like a dark animal in the corner. Lady Hawthorne supplied the combination with a detached precision that told its own story of a marriage conducted in the key of duty. Within were the usual papers, the occasional letter bound with green ribbon, a small velvet box holding 3 signet rings, and, tucked into a pocket at the back, a folded sheet with a smear of blue chalk along the edge, such as a carpenter's line might leave. Poirot did not open it there. He held it a moment, feeling its weight with his fingers, then returned it to its place. Later, he said, almost cheerfully, we will keep the surprises for their proper moment. Do you always contrive these theatricals? Miss Lydia asked, tart as an apple. Never, said Poirot. They contrive themselves. He shut the safe with a sigh that could have been satisfaction or regret, and we went down once more. In the hall, he paused beneath the long case clock. It had been wound. The pendulum swung with the serious benevolence of a judge. Poirot touched the case with a knuckle, very lightly. The chime rods gave a small, anticipatory tremor. "At 9, it sings," he said. "If one tied, no, it is not necessary to invent already. We will sleep. In the morning, we speak to the doctor, also to the woman in the village to whom Miss Lydia wrote so firmly." He looked straight at Miss Lydia until she coloured and lifted her chin. "And if Monsieur Reed's headache has departed, we will ask him again whether it was the afternoon or the morning. Sometimes, between one sleep and another, the memory improves its manners." We went to our rooms. I confess sleep did not descend at once. The house seemed to listen, as if it had developed ears to hear itself accused. Once, far off, a door clicked softly, the mouse's tread of a late-going servant, perhaps, and from the lawn a fox barked with that unearthly cry that makes even a sensible man uncomfortable. I lay awake with those 9 slow chimes counting the previous night in my head, one by one, and heard beneath them that thin insect scrape of a bent needle and a voice that might have been a man's or a very clever lie. I was woken not by the sun, but by the soft, deliberate rap of Poirot at my door. He entered without waiting for my reply, faultlessly dressed and already radiating that air of having arranged the morning before anyone else had thought to get out of bed. He carried under his arm a ledger, and in his hand a folded scrap of blue chalked paper, the one from the safe the night before. "My dear Hastings, it is time for our little promenade. The air will be invigorating, and the village not far. We must see Dr. Willoughby before he leaves on his rounds." It was barely 8 when we stepped out into the brisk March air. A pale mist lay in hollows, and the gravel crunched underfoot with that particular sound that suggests frost somewhere nearby. Poirot walked briskly, keeping his cane tucked under his arm rather than using it, for his mind was already marching ahead of us. "You recall, Hastings," he said, "the combination of the safe. Lady Hawthorne knew it. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. That tells me something about the habits of Sir Charles, n'est-ce pas?" "That he trusted her," I suggested. "Or," Poirot replied, "that the safe contained nothing she was not meant to see, at least not in ordinary times. Yet the chalked paper, it was hidden, though not very well. I think it was not for her eyes." We reached the doctor's neat white house, just as a groom was leading a trap from the stable. Dr. Willoughby, a stocky man in tweeds, opened the door himself and looked faintly surprised to see us. Poirot introduced himself with all courtesy and went straight to the matter. "It is about the tonic you supply to Sir Charles Hawthorne. You will be so good as to tell me the composition?" The doctor frowned, but the presence of Scotland Yard's Inspector Japp, summoned by Poirot's wire the previous night and now approaching along the path, gave him a sense of official sanction. "It's a heart stimulant," Willoughby said at last. "Mild, digitalis in small dose with caffeine. Sir Charles had a touch of arrhythmia, nothing grave. He was careful to take it only when he felt the need." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "And the prescription? It was filled. When last?" "3 weeks ago. Mr. Reed fetched it." "And before that?" "Always the same. Reed collected it. Sir Charles disliked idle chatter in the village." Poirot inclined his head. "Did you see him yesterday?" "Number Y was in Godalming most of the afternoon. If he told anyone he was coming to see me, that's news to me." We left the doctor with his morning's patients and began the return walk. Japp, falling into step with us, gave a sideways glance at Poirot. "So Reed lied about the errand. That's something." "Something, yes," Poirot agreed mildly. "But lying about where one's employer spent the afternoon is not the same as killing him. We must ask, why protect the truth of an afternoon's journey? What is there in the time between 4 and 6 that must be hidden, and for whose sake?" When we reached the Grange, Graves met us with a letter on a salver. "Delivered by hand, sir. Found in the box this morning." The envelope bore no stamp, only the name Monsieur Poirot in a thin, sloping hand. He slit it delicately. Inside was a single sheet, typewritten, unsigned. "You will not find what you are looking for. Sir Charles was not murdered. Let the matter rest. No threat, no demand, just that flat injunction." Poirot read it twice, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket, as if it were no more than an invitation to tea. "Curious," he murmured. "The anonymous letter that does not warn of danger, but of futility. Often, Hastings, it is the surest sign that one is on the right path." In the drawing-room, Lady Hawthorne was directing Celia in the arrangement of flowers, her movements precise, her expression cool. Miss Lydia sat with her knitting, the needles clicking like a faint metronome. Simon Vale, hunched over the newspaper, looked up with a guarded expression. Richard came in last, smelling faintly of cigars. Poirot addressed them as though nothing had happened. "Mes amis, I have a few small questions before I trouble you no more until this evening. Firstly, did Sir Charles have any carpentering done recently? Any alterations, perhaps to a cabinet or safe?" Richard shook his head. "Not that I know of." Miss Lydia sniffed. "He had the shelves in the study adjusted last month. They were sagging under the weight of books." "By whom?" "Fellow from the village, Jackson." Poirot nodded, filing this away. "And the long case clock. Has anyone had it cleaned or repaired in recent months?" "Father had it serviced before Christmas," Richard said, looking puzzled. "Why?" "Because," Poirot said pleasantly, "sometimes a clock tells more than the hour." He turned to Celia. "Madame, forgive me. I understand you wear verbena scent. When did you last come into the study before last night?" She blinked at the abruptness. "Yesterday morning. I left some flowers there." "Alone?" "Yes." "Why?" She stopped, perhaps catching herself before the question turned to protest. Poirot turned from her without answering, which is his way when he has learned more than he wishes to show. "And now, I must trouble Monsieur Vale. You had coffee with Sir Charles at 6:50. Did you leave the study before Madame Celia entered?" "I did," Simon said shortly. "I went upstairs to dress. I heard her in there calling for her bracelet. Something metallic fell. I thought she'd dropped it." Poirot's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Something metallic?" A small clink. Could have been the bracelet. Poirot let it pass and suggested a short break before luncheon. Jap took the opportunity to wander the grounds. I followed Poirot back into the study. He went straight to the mantel and stood over the coffee cup. "Hastings, imagine the scent of verbena, the clink of metal, the bent needle, the hair caught at the turntable. These are the breadcrumbs, yes? But where do they lead? To the murderer, or to the one who wishes us to think we have found him?" Before I could answer, Graves appeared again, this time with a visiting card. "Mr. Jackson to see you, sir. He says it's about the shelves." The carpenter was a wiry man with careful hands and the open, weathered face of one used to speaking plainly. "I came because I heard about Sir Charles. Terrible business. I thought, well, maybe it's nothing, but last week I was called to look at the clock in the hall. Sir Charles said it was chiming too hard, rattling the glass. Asked me to check the strike mechanism." "And did you?" Poirot asked. "I did, but here's the thing. It wasn't off at all. Seemed more like he wanted me to see how the hammer worked on the chime rods. Showed me where you could hook a wire to the lever, and then he laughed and said, 'Don't tell the wife. She'll think I'm starting another of my tricks.'" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And you did not mention this before?" "Didn't think it mattered," Jackson said, looking uneasy. "Au contraire," Poirot murmured. "It matters very much indeed." After Jackson had gone, Poirot stood for a long moment in the doorway of the study, looking out toward the clock in the hall. He was preparing something, Hastings. Whether as a joke, or as a warning, or as a trap, we shall see. But if he prepared it, another could have found it ready. The luncheon bell interrupted us. and we joined the others at table. Conversation was sparse. The air seemed to carry its own tension, like the taut skin of a drum. Halfway through the meal, Poirot set down his fork and addressed Richard. "Monsieur, the accounts. You will permit me to examine them after we eat? There is a small curiosity. Nothing alarming." Richard agreed with ill grace. After the meal, in the study, Poirot spread the ledgers across the desk, running a fingertip down columns, pausing over entries with the care of a man reading the margins of a book. At last, he tapped one page. "Voilà. 5 weeks ago, a withdrawal of £50, marked private advance. To whom?" "That's my father's business," Richard said stiffly. "Exactement," Poirot agreed. "And yet, when money moves unexpectedly, it leaves ripples. I have already seen the playbills in Monsieur Vale's possession, and I see the decorator's account for a London flat, paid in advance. Someone here was planning a change, mes amis. Sir Charles may have intended it, or he may have resisted it, but he did not die without leaving behind the current of his intentions." The door opened. Celia stood there, pale but composed. "Mr. Poirot, there's something I should tell you. Last night before dinner, I went into the study, not just for my bracelet. I saw the gramophone already wound, the brake set, and the disc in place. I thought it odd. I didn't touch it. But now you are not so sure," Poirot finished gently. "Merci, madame. That is most valuable." After she left, he leaned back in Sir Charles's chair. "Hastings, we are close to the moment when the shadows will begin to shorten. But first, we must recreate the 9 o'clock of yesterday. Every movement, every sound, every glance." Japp, who had reappeared with the air of a man sensing something imminent, grinned. "You're thinking of gathering them all together?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Not yet, but soon. And when I do, mon cher Japp, the gramophone will play again. Only this time, it will speak the truth." Poirot was up from the chair, almost before his last words had faded, moving with that small, precise energy that meant some detail had just slotted into place in his mind. He went to the gramophone, stood over it, and let his fingertips hover just above the turntable, as if gauging its balance. Then, with the delicacy of a watchmaker, he shifted the brake to its catch and stepped back. "Hastings, picture it. The lever is set, the disc in place. At 9, the mechanism is released, not by a hand in the room, but by something prepared. Perhaps the chimes of the clock, perhaps a thread pulled from beyond the door. The voice begins, cold, theatrical. At the same moment, those in the drawing room hear it and rush in. Voilà, the scene is staged." I said what was already in my head. "You're thinking Sir Charles meant it as a performance." "Or as a demonstration," Poirot said, "to prove some point. But if so, why was he dead when they arrived? That is the question which does not fit into the frame. I must know whether the death was at 9 or before." We had barely left the study when Graves appeared with a note in hand. "Brought up from the village, sir, by one of the children from the school. Said it was found under the gate. The paper was cheap, the writing blocky and clumsy, as though the writer meant to disguise his hand. Stop asking questions. He deserved what he got." Poirot read it without a flicker, then handed it to Japp, who let out a low whistle. "That's no villager. That's someone in this house trying to spook you off." Poirot's eyes moved, not towards anyone in particular, but along the invisible line between the drawing room and the study, as if mapping the geography of deceit. "They are careless to send 2 anonymous notes in one morning. It tells me there is fear, but not unity." He asked for Richard Hawthorne, who came with a tight jaw and the look of a man already tired of questions. Poirot, polite as ever, drew him into the hall, where the long case clock loomed benignly. "Tell me, monsieur, when your father retired last night, did you see him drink anything? Did he take his tonic, perhaps?" Richard shook his head. "Not that I noticed. He wasn't in here long before. He gestured towards the study. Why? It is only that the glass beside his chair was not full. Someone had been drinking from it. But the coffee, the coffee still puzzles me. Richard glanced at the clock. Is this really necessary? My father's dead, and you're playing with... Poirot interrupted with a little bow. I am doing only what is necessary to learn how he died. For example, this clock, it was serviced in December, yes? And after that, your father asked a carpenter to examine the chime. Richard looked blank. Did he? No one told me. Poirot let him go and, without comment, returned to the study. He opened the desk's right-hand drawer and began removing its contents one by one. Stationery, a box of spare needles, a small notebook bound in leather. The notebook he opened, flipping with the lightest touch until he came to a page halfway through. Across it was written, in Sir Charles's neat hand, "Test break at 9. Record in place. Watch their faces." Poirot stared at it for a moment, then shut the book. Hastings, we are nearly there. He meant to play them something he believed would show them what they were. Then someone took advantage, I said slowly, and made sure that when the voice played, he was dead. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. Or perhaps they ensured that the voice would say what they wished, not what he had recorded. It was mid-afternoon before the next piece of the puzzle came to us. Celia, pale but determined, came into the study where Poirot and I sat with the ledger. I remembered something else. Yesterday, before dinner, I saw Mr. Reed leave the study with a small paper packet. He looked, well, furtive. When he saw me, he said it was needles for the gramophone, but the packet was too small for that. Poirot's eyes warmed with approval. That is well remembered, madame. You see, when one speaks, the mind turns the stones over and sometimes finds the little worms beneath. He asked for Reed at once. The secretary entered, his headache now wholly absent. Poirot motioned him to sit. Monsieur Reed, you told me the disc was made on Tuesday afternoon. You also told me Sir Charles took it himself. Yet Madame Celia tells me she saw you carry a small packet from this room before dinner. Needles, you said. Was that true? Reed's mouth thinned. It was a record, sir. A blank. I meant to take it to my room to try a new stylus I'd ordered. Sir Charles saw me and told me to leave it here. Poirot leaned forward. And did you? Leave it here? I put it back. Exactement, Poirot said softly. So it was in your hands for only a moment, enough to replace one disc with another if one wished. And, Monsieur Reed, if one had the original in one's possession, one might play it later and learn whether the words we heard at 9 were truly those of Sir Charles. For the first time, Reed's composure cracked. Why would I? He stopped, pressing his lips together. Poirot let the silence stretch, then dismissed him with a courteous nod. When the door closed, he looked at me with that cat-like satisfaction I had learned to respect. There, Hastings, we have the means for an exchange. What remains is to learn who profited from it. Japp came in then, his coat smelling faintly of the cold air outside. I've been down to the village. That woman Miss Lydia wrote to? Name of Mrs. Green. Widow. Your Miss Lydia's letter told her to stop bothering Sir Charles. Apparently he'd been helping her with rent. Helping her? Poirot said sharply. Financially. But here's the rub. Mrs. Green says Sir Charles hinted last week that he might move her into one of the cottages near the Grange. That wouldn't go down well with certain members of the family. Poirot's face took on that serene stillness that meant a piece of the pattern had fallen into place. Ah, so Sir Charles was rearranging his pieces on the board. Some he meant to move closer, some perhaps he meant to move away entirely, and someone feared where their square might be. He closed the ledger, rose, and dusted his cuffs. It is time, Hastings. Tonight, after dinner, we shall have them all together in the drawing-room. The gramophone will play again, but this time it will not be the voice of Sir Charles that interests me. It will be the faces of those who hear it. That evening, the dining table was subdued. Forks touched plates without appetite. Wine-glasses stood half full. Poirot was in good humour, chatting of Belgian pastries and the unreliability of English trains. When at last we moved into the drawing-room, he took up his place by the mantel. "Mes amis, I have asked you here because there remains a little confusion, a small disorder, which is not agreeable to me. Last night, you heard the voice of Sir Charles declare his death. Tonight, you will hear a voice again. It may be the same, it may be different. I wish only that you listen." He went to the gramophone, set the brake, and let the turntable spin. The first words came, the same chilling declaration. "By the time you hear this, I shall be dead." But then, instead of the flat phrases we had heard before, there was a pause and a chuckle, and Sir Charles's unmistakable voice saying, "You will be wondering why I have called you here. It is to tell you that among you there is one who would prefer me gone." A collective breath seemed to catch in the room. Lady Hawthorne's face was frozen. Miss Lydia's needles had stilled. Richard's jaw clenched. Celia's eyes darted from one to the other. Simon Vale sat forward, transfixed. Reed, standing at the back, had gone very white. Poirot lifted the needle, letting the last echo die. "Voilà," he said softly. "Now you see, the message we heard last night was not this one. It was altered. And when a message is altered, it is because the original would have been dangerous to someone in this room." The silence was deep enough to hear the wind pressing at the windows. Poirot looked from face to face, as if weighing each one for its share of guilt. "Shall we, then, find out who feared Sir Charles's words most?" For a few moments, no one spoke. It was as though the air itself had thickened, making words slow to form. Poirot, with the patience of a man perfectly in command of his stage, allowed the silence to do its work, his gaze travelling from face to face with the precision of a surgeon deciding where to make the first incision. "It is curious, is it not?" he said at last, his voice conversational, almost indulgent. "Sir Charles intended to speak to you of danger, of treachery perhaps, and instead, at 9 o'clock, you hear a version that speaks only of his death, cold and without explanation. One asks oneself, who, in this small gathering, had both the opportunity to change the record and the motive to remove the warning?" Lady Hawthorne's lips pressed into a thinner line. "Mr. Poirot, are you suggesting that one of us, one of his family, would—" Poirot lifted a hand, gentle but firm. "I suggest nothing, madame. I present only the facts. The original record was replaced. That requires possession of the gramophone, or at least of the disc, between the moment Sir Charles made it and the moment it played. That window was not large, and the person who did it would need privacy, or skill, or both." Jap, leaning against the door with his arms folded, was watching the faces too. "Whoever did it must have known exactly what they were doing," he said. "That brake trick, you don't get that right by accident." Poirot's eyes rested briefly on Reed. "Monsieur, you have worked with both the gramophone and the recording attachment, n'est-ce pas? You told me you cut the disc on Tuesday. You told me you put it back. Yet somehow, when 9 o'clock came, it was no longer there." Reed swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "I didn't—" He stopped, glanced at the others, and then, with a small shudder, sat down. Poirot did not press him. "Perhaps you did not. Perhaps another took advantage of your momentary possession of it. Madame Celia, when you entered the study to search for your bracelet, you saw the disc on the turntable?" Her eyes flicked towards Richard before returning to Poirot. "Yes, I didn't touch it. Did you notice the label?" She hesitated. "It was blank, I think. I didn't read it closely." Poirot's moustaches twitched. Monsieur Vale, you had coffee with Sir Charles before dinner. Was the gramophone present then? Vale shrugged uneasily. I suppose it was. I wasn't paying attention. We were arguing. And when people argue, they sometimes do not notice what is in front of them, Poirot murmured. Or perhaps they notice very well, if the argument is but a cover for their purpose. This last suggestion made Vale's head jerk up, but Poirot had already moved on, turning to Miss Lydia. Mademoiselle, you spoke yesterday of propriety, yet I think you have already guessed that Sir Charles intended to assist Mrs. Green in the village more substantially than before. Her nostrils flared. I disapproved of that woman's influence. I told him so. If he intended to give her one of the estate cottages, I would have opposed it openly. But kill him to prevent it? Ridiculous. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Not ridiculous, merely human. Fear of losing influence, of being displaced, can drive one to desperate measures. But you are correct, mademoiselle, that such a thing is not proved by suspicion alone. He began to pace slowly, his hands folded behind him. Let us then reconstruct. At some point before dinner, the disc was altered or exchanged. It could have been in the afternoon, it could have been in the evening, but it was certainly before Sir Charles entered the study at 8:30. He sits down, perhaps expecting to begin his little drama at 9. Instead, when the brake releases and the record plays, it is not his chosen words that greet his family, but a death announcement. Japp said, "So the real question is, was he already dead when the voice began?" "Just so," said Poirot, turning sharply to face him. "If he was, then the replacement was not merely to suppress his warning, but to make murder look like suicide or a morbid jest. If he was alive at 9, then the record itself is not the murder, but the concealment of another danger." Richard shifted in his chair. "But if you don't know which, how can you accuse anyone?" Poirot's expression softened, almost indulgent. "Because, monsieur, the person who changed the record had to know its contents in advance, and only one person here had the chance to hear it before it was meant to be played." Reed's head came up sharply, his face pale. "You mean me?" "I mean you," Poirot said, "or someone to whom you spoke of it." His voice dropped, silken now. "You did not mention that you were in debt, Monsieur Reed. £100 owed to a man in Guildford. Sir Charles learned of it last week. He was not pleased." Reed's eyes widened. "How?" "I read it in the accounts," Poirot said simply. "A discreet entry, written in another hand, but under Sir Charles's signature. He paid it for you, and then he decided, perhaps, that your services would no longer be required." Reed looked down, his hands tight on his knees. "I didn't kill him. I was afraid of losing my post. Yes, but I didn't kill him." Poirot gave a small nod, as if accepting that, for the moment. "Then perhaps you merely helped someone else, thinking no great harm would come of it. In that case, Monsieur Reed, you will do well to remember exactly who asked you to make that recording in the first place, and who was in the study after you left." He let that hang in the air, then glanced at the clock. "It grows late. Tomorrow morning we will have the answer. I shall require your cooperation in a small experiment. We will recreate last night exactly. You will all take your places as before. The gramophone will play, and I will observe." Japp raised an eyebrow. "You think the guilty party will give themselves away?" "I think," Poirot said, "that when the voice speaks the truth this time, the eyes will betray what the lips will not confess. And if that is not enough," his gaze swept over them, and his tone hardened, "then I will tell you myself whose hand wound the brake, whose fingers changed the disc, and whose mind arranged the death of Sir Charles Hawthorne." He left them with that, and the rest of the evening passed in a strained quiet. When at last we retired, I could hear movement along the corridor, a door opening softly, the faint scrape of a shoe on floorboards. Poirot, in the next room, did not stir, though I knew he heard it all. He was waiting, letting the mouse run about the trap until morning. As I drifted into a restless sleep, one thought kept circling back, the face each of them had worn when the true recording played. Surprise, yes, but on one or two faces, something more. Not fear of what it said, but of what it meant. And that, I suspected, was the thread Poirot would pull in the morning, until the whole thing unravelled. I woke to the smell of coal smoke and damp wool, and the faintest suggestion of lavender in the corridor outside. Someone had passed my door, and not long before. Poirot entered a minute later, faultless as ever, a small paper packet in his hand that he set on the washstand, with the air of a man laying down a trump he would not yet show. He did not comment on the scent, though his nostrils had that tiny pinch that means he has noticed and stored a fact. Up, Hastings. Before breakfast we pay a call upon the locksmith. After, we speak again to our good carpenter. Then we prepare our little theatre for tonight. The village locksmith proved to be a compact man with an unhurried voice, to whom keys were not implements so much as relations, each with its quirks and impertinences. He confirmed, with a shrug that was almost philosophical, that the bedrooms and studies at the Grange were all on one pattern, and that anyone with a service blank and a file could fashion a passable key. Wouldn't recommend it for life and death, mind, he added, but for a tidy job. Oh, yes. Life and death, murmured Poirot, as if the phrase had presented itself for inspection. Do you keep records of duplicates made for Hawthorne Grange? For graves, yes. 2 for the study last autumn, 1 for the dressing-room safe cupboard. Different. Lock. Around January. Poirot's eye sharpened. By whom ordered? Secretary Fellow collected them. Read. We left with a small brass blank that the locksmith pressed upon Poirot for your curiosity, and walked back under a sky the colour of a dusted slate. I could feel the case tightening around Reed like a noose, and I said so. Poirot only shook his head gently. No, the rope is cast in many directions. The neck it finds will not be his. Reed makes things possible, yes, but not necessary. Remember the psychology. He is a tidy man who depends. The mind that kills here is a mind that arranges for itself and for others. Jackson, the carpenter, met us at the gate of the Grange, hat in hand, as though the house itself required respect. He had brought a small, battered toolbox. Poirot led him straight to the hall clock, and with Jap summoned from the breakfast room, asked that the release trick be demonstrated with whatever innocent contrivance Jackson favoured. With a light wire, you can lift the strike lever off the stop, Jackson explained, nimble fingers at work. Tie the other end to a peg. It'll hold till something tugs it. When the tug comes, the lever drops, and if you've slacked the gramophone brake with a notch, why, she runs. And the tug, Poirot prompted, eyes half closed. Door opening, string through, someone walking, lots of ways. Jackson looked up, thoughtful. But here, your clock's chime is heavy. If someone left the lever just so, the first strike at 9 could shake it free. Temperamental, but doable. Poirot's gaze drifted to the study doorway. Or a bracelet, perhaps, catching where it should not. What we call in Belgium the accident that is the cousin of the intention. He thanked Jackson, pressed a note into his hand, and when we were alone again, stood very still, listening to what was not there. You smell it also? He asked, low. Verbena, I admitted. Celia. He nodded once, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Come, we will eat. Then the doctor. Breakfast was subdued. The newspaper lay unread by Simon's elbow. Lady Hawthorne poured coffee without looking at the cups, and Miss Lydia's knitting lay coiled, the needles silent. Reed did not appear. When Graves reported that Mr. Reed felt unwell and had taken to his bed again, Jap grunted and looked at Poirot. Poirot only stirred his porridge as if its symmetry interested him. Dr. Willoughby received us after breakfast with the professional patience of a man who has told the same few truths often and will tell them again without resentment. He had seen Sir Charles many times, he repeated. The heart was not perfect, but it was serviceable. The tonic contained digitalis, yes, but in a dose calculated, and he had never known Sir Charles to be careless with it. When Poirot asked, quite as if he were asking the weather, how one would detect an excess of digitalis after death, Willoughby frowned. "It is not very certain," he said. "We haven't the facilities here for analysis of organs. If there were suspicion, we could send to London. Symptoms in life would tell me more. Nausea, vomiting, confusion, increased arrhythmia. Was there any such?" "Alas," said Poirot, "he died with too much dignity to confide such details to us." We were halfway back across the hall at the Grange, when Graves came hurrying, his composure a little cracked. "Mr. Poirot, sir, Mr. Reed is very poorly. I took him a tray and, well, he's limp as a rag. The doctor, perhaps." We went at once. Reed lay grey-faced, a wet sheen on his brow, the glass by his bed half empty, the dark draught clinging to its sides. Willoughby was brisk and efficient. "What the devil? Pulse thready. What have you been taking?" "The headache drops," Reed managed. "The same as yesterday." "Yesterday they were harmless enough," the doctor said shortly. He sniffed the bottle, his face tightening. "Good Lord, this is not what I prescribed." Poirot's eyes flicked to me, then to Jap. "Another crime, you see. Not so dramatic as the Gramophone. More practical." Reed rallied enough to whisper, "I didn't. No one. Graves brought it. I thought." He closed his eyes, and Willoughby waved us out with the authority of a man who will brook no witnesses to his work. In the corridor, Jap exploded softly. "So someone tried to shut him up. That puts paid to your not necessary." "On the contrary," said Poirot, "it confirms it. Reed knows something he may not even know he knows, and someone fears that the small thing will be the thread that unravels the large thing." He pointed at the glass on the bedside table. "Do not let it be washed." The order, surprisingly, was obeyed without fuss. Graves, stricken and appalled, handed the tray to Jap, as a penitent might surrender a stolen idol. Poirot did not gloat. He only said, "Courage, Graves. It is for the best that we learn whom we serve. No?" And Graves, blinking rapidly, gave a strangled sound that might have been assent. Poirot spent the next hour in what looked like aimless domestics. He asked Lady Hawthorne for a needle and thread to repair an insult to my cuff, and borrowed from Miss Lydia a small silver hairpin for symmetry. From Celia he requested a hand mirror, claiming his own had suffered a scratch in travel. She handed it over, and he thanked her, as though she had saved his life. To Simon he addressed a few questions about theatre, how one teaches an audience to look the wrong way, and received in return irritation and a rueful smile. With Richard he walked the gravel to the stable and back, speaking of rents with the disarming ignorance of a foreigner, and returned with his shoes perfectly clean and his eyes inwardly bright. At noon, when he closed himself in the study with me, he took the small packet from the washstand and unwrapped it. Inside lay a sliver of waxed paper, and nestled within a shaving of black lacquer no larger than a fingernail, curved and fragile. "From the wastebasket," he said, "held overnight in my pocket until I could play with it. A shaving from the record, the first one, I think. It bears a trace of blue, a chalk dust. See?" I looked, and yes, there was the faintest bloom of colour. He placed the bit of lacquer beside the blue chalked paper from the safe, and for a moment I could almost imagine the smear leaping delicately from paper to disc. "He handled both," I said. "Sir Charles. Evidemment. The message with the warning, and the plan with the chalk. He cut the disc with his own hands, Hastings. But then, another hand came between the cutting and the playing. Tonight, we will teach the hands to reveal the mind." He spent half an hour with the gramophone then, not touching its guts so much as arranging its furniture. The table at a slight angle. The horn turned so the sound would carry first to one chair and then to the other. He adjusted the chair cushions by a finger's width and asked me to stand in the doorway and count my own heartbeats when the needle settled. It was as though he were setting light traps to catch the smallest movements. "Observe, mon ami," he said when he was satisfied. "From here one can see in the glass of the bookcase a reflection of that chair, and in the horn's lacquer the ghost of the mantle. I am not a policeman, but I am a man who likes mirrors. They have so much politeness. They show me what the human face, out of courtesy, might conceal." After luncheon, a disturbance sent us all to the landing. The door of Poirot's room stood ajar. The little valise he had set on the stand last night dragged half out, its lock scratched. Graves again, poor man, was the one to discover it when bringing hot water. "Nothing missing?" Poirot said mildly, closing the valise and setting it back, but I saw his eyes rest for a long moment on the keyhole. He then surprised me by opening the wardrobe and handing out to Jap a hatbox. "The disc," he said. "The original. It is not here." Jap's head came up. "You left it?" "In my pocket," said Poirot, tapping his breast, cheerful as a sparrow. "But someone hoped it was here. That is what interests me." The afternoon stretched like the taut skin of a drum. Reed, under Willoughby's care, rallied. The replaced draught had been nothing worse than chloral, the doctor said, in a dose unpleasant, but not fatal. "He'll do," Willoughby assured us. "The man who gave it to him had a crude hand. If that was meant to kill, it was a fool's attempt." "Or a warning to be quiet," Poirot said, and the doctor, who had no time for such games, snorted and returned to his patient. At 8:30 precisely, the household gathered once more. The drawing-room had the ceremonial feeling of a chapel before evensong. Poirot, immaculate and rather merry, welcomed us with a little bow. "Mes amis, we will be as we were, sit as last night, speak as last night, hear as last night, but this time," his eyes danced, "permit me a small improvement to the acoustics." He had drawn back the curtain an inch to reveal the hall clock's face, and in that narrow space I could see, faint as the thread on a spider's web, a line running from the clock's case to the study's door jamb, and from there, by some magician's art, for I could not immediately trace it, towards the gramophone. The door to the study stood ajar by the breadth of a hand. "Mr. Vale," Poirot said easily, "perhaps a bar of your play while we wait? No? Then we shall have instead the music of truth." The clock began its prelude to the hour, that soft stirring like the drawing of a bow before the note. At the first strike, something trembled. On the second, I felt rather than heard a tiny release, a click as discreet as a lifted latch. From the study, as if on cue, the gramophone's turntable whispered into motion, and a moment later, that voice we now knew as Sir Charles's filled the air, calm, amused, alive. "You will be wondering why I have called you here. It is to show you something about yourselves you already know, but do not admit. One of you is a thief of trust. One of you is a coward. One of you is a fool. I am not yet certain which is which. But by 9 o'clock tomorrow night, I shall know, and so will you." Poirot's hand, gentle as a blessing, dropped the brake. He had not watched the horn. He had watched the faces. In the glass of the bookcase behind Miss Lydia, I saw her mouth draw inward, thin and bloodless. In the horn's black curve I saw, reflected and warped, Simon Vale's fingers grip the arm of his chair. Lady Hawthorne did not move at all, which was its own motion. Richard's eyes went not to the study, but to his wife, and Celia closed her eyes for a single instant, as if listening for a sound within the sound. Only Reed, pale and exhausted, had not been permitted to attend. From the landing came the faint creak of a board as the doctor shifted in his chair by the patient's bed. When the last echo died, Poirot spoke so softly, I felt the words more than heard them. Now we know, do we not, why the record was changed. It is not only that Sir Charles intended to accuse, it is that he intended to name the quality and not the person. He wished to watch what you would do under the shadow of a name you might wear. Richard sprang to his feet. This is intolerable. His voice cracked on the last word. You set traps, you tinker with clocks. This is a house in mourning. Sit down, Lady Hawthorne said, in a tone that had chilled rooms for decades. He sat. Poirot's gaze moved past them and came to rest, not on a person, but on the small silver hairpin he had balanced earlier on the gramophone plinth. It lay where he had left it. He seemed satisfied. I tell you who altered the record, he said, colourless now. I will show you something. Hastings, if you please. I went to the study door and opened it fully. In the gap, threads gleamed where the light caught them, and with a flourish that was unlike him, almost theatrical, I lifted away the hair-thin line from its notch. In the same movement, Poirot stooped and plucked from the skirting, with 2 fingers, a shred of pale hair caught where it ought not to have been, and laid it on his palm. The thread, he said, does not judge. It only holds. But hairs, hairs are vain. They show where they have been. This one was there last night also. I did not need it then. I need it now only to comfort those who prefer the evidence that can be held to the evidence that can only be seen. Celia had not moved, but I saw the smallest tremor pass along her jaw. Simon Vale half rose in his seat. Miss Lydia's knitting fell, silent, to the carpet, and Richard leaned forward, as if braced against a blow he meant, absurdly, to meet with his chest. Poirot's voice was very gentle. Madame Celia, he said, do not be afraid. You are not the murderer. But last night, at 7:20, when you came into the study to find your bracelet, you dislodged the thread your father-in-law had set, and made his little theatrical certain. You released the mechanism, so that at 9 it would begin. And today, when you came to return me my mirror, you considered also whether the disc could be put out of my reach. It could not. You are not guilty of death. You are guilty only of an accident, and of fear. She lifted her head at that, a quick, painful motion, and I saw the relief lance through her and leave a different kind of fear in its place. Then who altered the record? Poirot finished for her. His eyes, bright as a blade, went past her to the mantel where a coffee cup still sat, because no one had thought to carry it away. The person who did that was in this room with Sir Charles before dinner, arguing. The person who drinks coffee when the others do not. The person who went to his room ostensibly to dress, and in truth to fetch a blank disc, returning by the servants' passage when the corridor was clear. The person who knows how to make an audience look away. The thief of trust, Sir Charles would have called him. The coward is another. Simon Vale's chair scraped. This is madness, he said hoarsely. If you think— I do not think, said Poirot, and all the gentleness was gone. I know, and I will prove it to you with your own trick. He stepped aside so that the horn of the gramophone stared directly at Vale, black and cold as an eye. Let us play it again, shall we? He said almost gaily. Not the voice of the dead. Your voice, Monsieur Vale, recorded 2 hours ago when you practiced, in this very room, the speech you intended to make if I accused another. The room seemed to tilt. Vale made a violent, strangled movement, and stopped, because there is a point at which the body knows futility better than the mind. Poirot let the silence crackle for a heartbeat longer, then lifted the needle without setting it. Non, he said softly. Another time. Tonight I prefer to let the living speak without the help of machines. Tomorrow, when the sun is honest, we will finish. He inclined his head to Vale, as if they were at a polite supper. Do not go far, monsieur. The coward runs. The thief waits to see if the hand will close. It will. He turned to Japp. You will watch him, my friend, and send a man to fetch the solicitor in town. There is a codicil to a will I think has not yet been lodged, and it will explain why there was such haste to silence a dead man." Jap, whose face had the dangerous calm of a tide pulling out, nodded once and stepped to the door. And as the company broke in a low murmuring of chairs and skirts and quick breaths, Poirot stood where he was, very still, and looked at the clock. It had finished its song and was counting the seconds again, small, regular steps towards a point he already saw, and the rest of us were only now beginning to suspect. The drawing room emptied with the uneasy shuffle of a theatre audience dismissed before the final act. Chairs scraped, skirts whispered, the long case clock ticked on with a faint smugness, as if pleased to have played its part. Simon Vale stood by the mantel, rigid, one hand resting on the coffee cup, as though he might hurl it. Jap planted himself by the door, broad and immovable, a man who could wait until the walls grew moss. Poirot had not moved from the gramophone, his fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the turntable, the way a conductor might rest a hand on the score after the orchestra had fallen silent. "You see, Hastings," he murmured without turning, "the mind that alters the record is not a mind that kills with its own hands. It is a mind that fears being shown for what it is, and so rearranges the scene to erase the danger. The true killer's danger lies elsewhere." I followed his glance toward Lady Hawthorne, who had paused in the doorway, her profile sharp as a carving against the dim hall beyond. She did not look at Vale, nor at her son, but directly at Poirot. "If you have more to say, Mr. Poirot, say it now. I dislike suspense." "Madame," Poirot said gently, "suspense is only a cousin to truth. But I will say this. Your husband was not poisoned in his coffee. He did not take his tonic in fatal dose. He died because his heart, which was not perfect, was made to race beyond its limit, and the means was not in a cup or a bottle, but in words." She turned then, slowly, one brow arched. "Words?" Poirot left the gramophone and crossed to the hearth, where the heat had sunk to a dull red. Sir Charles had a plan. At 9 o'clock, the gramophone would speak, and he would watch the faces of those who heard. He intended to accuse, but not directly. He preferred to see which mask would slip first. That required his presence, alive, in the room. But someone who knew how easily his heart could be driven into crisis, chose to confront him with the one subject that could do so. He looked now at Richard, whose knuckles had gone white on the arm of his chair. "The codicil, monsieur. The change to his will that cut your inheritance by half, to settle property upon another. I think you learned of it only hours before his death." Richard's jaw worked. "You're saying I shouted him into the grave?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that you argued with him, fiercely, between 8:30 and 9, in this very room. That you left him flushed, short of breath, determined to go through with his little drama, to prove himself still master. The exertion, the anger, these were enough to finish what time had begun." "That's not murder," Richard said, but his voice had dropped. "No," said Poirot, "it is not murder in the sense of poison slipped or a blow struck. But it is a death brought on knowingly, recklessly, by one who wished to stop a change they feared. You did not know the gramophone's message would be altered. Vale saw to that. You only knew that if Sir Charles were not alive to sign the codicil, the old will would stand." Richard's eyes went to his mother, and something unspoken passed between them, an appeal, a warning, I could not tell which. Lady Hawthorne's gaze did not shift from Poirot. "You have evidence?" "I have the doctor's word that Sir Charles's heart could not bear sustained anger. I have Graves's statement that he heard your voice raised in here at 8:45, and your father's reply, short, clipped, as though he struggled for breath. I have the fact that when you found him at 9, you did not at once call for help, but for the others. And I have your face, monsieur, when the true recording spoke of cowardice." Jap's voice came from the doorway, low but edged. That's enough to keep you where I can find you. Vale, too. Different charges, maybe, but the same cell until I'm done." Vale gave a laugh that was too high to be amused. "So it's all neatly parcelled. Richard kills him with a row. I swap the record to save my skin. And the rest of you go home satisfied?" "Not quite," Poirot said, "for there is still the matter of Reed, and of the draft that might have killed him. That was not the work of either of you." Miss Lydia, who had lingered near the window like an offended sentinel, gave a sharp, mirthless smile. "You think that was me? I told Reed to his face I thought him impertinent, but I don't waste poison on the help." "Indeed," Poirot said, "because the help, in this house, is never just the help. The hand that prepared that draft knew Reed had been in possession of the original disc. It was a warning to keep silent, given by one who feared the whole truth would surface, that Sir Charles's original accusation might have included not only cowardice and theft, but something more intimate." Lady Hawthorne's hands, resting lightly on the back of a chair, were utterly still. "This is becoming tawdry, Mr. Poirot." "It is becoming true," Poirot said softly. "Mrs. Green in the village is not only the recipient of Sir Charles's charity, she is the mother of his child, a child grown now, of age to be acknowledged and to inherit. That is the provision in the codicil. The knowledge of it lay heavy on more than one heart here, but only one person had both the motive to silence Reed and the freedom to walk unobserved into his room, the mistress of the house." For the first time, Lady Hawthorne's poise cracked, by the smallest degree, but enough for me to see. "You dare—" "I dare nothing," Poirot said. "I state. The doctor will confirm the draught in Reed's glass was prepared in the china cup from your own room. Graves will confirm he carried it down, believing it harmless. And Reed, when he wakes, will tell us that you came to his door last night, ostensibly to inquire after his headache, and left him with a few kind words about loyalty." Celia made a small sound, as if something in her had been both confirmed and wounded. Richard turned away. Miss Lydia's mouth tightened until it was no more than a seam. Poirot, having delivered these blows without raising his voice, stepped back to the gramophone. "You see, Hastings, it is not always one hand that makes the crime. It is many hands, each doing its part, the alteration, the provocation, the silencing. In another house, on another night, Sir Charles might have lived to speak his accusation. Here, each act hastened his end, or buried the truth of it." Vale, his face ashen, said nothing. Richard stared at the carpet. Lady Hawthorne's chin lifted, the gesture of a woman who will endure disgrace, as she has endured everything else, with control. "And what will you do with this tapestry of guilt, Mr. Poirot? It is not the neat knot you so enjoy." "It is neat enough," Poirot said. "For the law, there is Vale's obstruction and falsification, Richard's culpable provocation, your attempt to intimidate a witness. Whether they will prosecute, I cannot say. But for me—" He touched the arm of the gramophone, still and silent now. "For me, the pattern is clear. That is all I require." Japp's men were summoned quietly. Vale and Richard were taken aside, not yet in irons, but under watch. Lady Hawthorne was left standing by the hearth, the firelight painting her face into something almost regal. Miss Lydia bent to retrieve her knitting, and began again, as though the last hour had been no more than an interlude. Celia slipped from the room without a word. When the last of them had gone, Poirot and I stood alone with the gramophone. He regarded it with a faint, almost regretful smile. "It is a pity, Hastings. Sir Charles devised a little theatre to reveal the truth, and in the end it was the truth that killed him. That, and the weaknesses he sought to expose. I thought of the voice on the true record, measured and amused. One of you is a thief of trust. One of you is a coward. One of you is a fool. The words seemed to hang in the air, unclaimed and yet belonging to each of them in some measure. And which was he, Poirot? I asked quietly. Poirot's gaze moved to the clock, its pendulum swinging with tireless precision. He was the stage manager, mon ami, and perhaps, like all stage managers, he forgot that actors are most dangerous when they decide to improvise. He straightened his cuffs. Come, we have finished here. The air is too thick with performances. We left the room as the clock began its slow chime for the half-hour, the sound following us down the hall. Behind us, the gramophone sat with its black horn aimed at the empty chairs, ready to speak again if anyone cared to set the needle. But for the first time since we had arrived, the house seemed in no hurry to hear it. The morning broke grey and unhurried, as if the weather itself preferred to wait and see what Poirot would do before committing to any drama of its own. A mist lay low over the lawns, muting the lines of the hedges and softening the austere angles of Hawthorne Grange. I found Poirot in the breakfast room, standing before the window with his hands clasped behind him, not eating, but watching the gravel drive where Jap's motor waited like a coiled animal. He turned when I entered, and his eyes were bright in a way that told me the case was not yet finished in his mind, no matter what appearances he had given the night before. "You have slept well, Hastings?" "Bon. Today we shall speak with Mrs. Green. The little village truth. It will fill the gaps left by the grand house truth." "Surely you have enough already," I said, pouring myself coffee. "You named Vale, you confronted Richard, and you even pointed a finger at Lady Hawthorne. What more can there be?" "The heart of the matter," he said simply. "We have named the hands that moved, but not the shadow behind them, and until I see that shadow in full, I am not satisfied." He allowed me 10 minutes to finish breakfast before we set out. The village was still in that peculiar quiet of mid-morning, where the day's business has begun, but has not yet spilled into the streets. Mrs. Green's cottage stood at the far edge, a low building with a thatched roof and a garden that had known better care. She answered the door with a wary look that softened only slightly when she saw Poirot. "You're the gentleman from the Grange," she said, her voice low. "I heard there was trouble." "There was death, madame," Poirot replied gently, "and I think you knew the man who died very well indeed." She hesitated, then stepped back to let us in. The sitting room was clean but sparse, the fire laid but not lit. On the mantel was a photograph of a young man in uniform, his features strong enough to make me glance at Poirot. He had seen it too. "My son," Mrs. Green said, noticing our look. "William. His father was, well, you'll have guessed." Poirot inclined his head. Sir Charles acknowledged him privately, but was on the point of acknowledging him more publicly. There was to be a codicil to his will. Her eyes shone, though whether with pride or sorrow I could not tell. "He told me. Said he'd see Will settled proper when he came out of service. But I warned him there'd be those who wouldn't stand for it." "You feared for him?" "I feared for his peace," she said, looking away. "Charles liked his order, didn't like a fuss. But there was fuss enough already, I reckon, and more coming." Poirot's tone remained warm, but there was a new edge beneath it. "Who came to see you last week, madame, from the Grange?" She hesitated. "Miss Lydia. Told me to stop making myself noticed. Said I was upsetting the household. She was polite enough, but you could tell she meant business." "And on the day before Sir Charles died?" "No one from the family. But Mr. Vale passed me in the lane. He stopped to ask if Charles had been here that afternoon. I told him no. He hadn't been by in 2 days." Poirot's eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. "Merci, madame. You have helped more than you know." Back at the Grange, Jap was waiting with an expression halfway between impatience and reluctant admiration. "We've turned out Vale's room, found theatre bills, letters from half the London stage, and," he held up a small envelope, "a key blank with the locksmith's mark. Fits the study." Poirot took it, weighing it in his palm, as though considering its moral density. So, Vale could come and go to the one room that mattered. That gives him the opportunity not only to change the record, but to search for whatever else might threaten him. Did you find the original disc? Japp shook his head. Not yet. Poirot looked at me. We must assume it is gone for good, but the words remain in memory, and they are enough. The household was gathered again after luncheon, not by command, but by the slow gravity of events drawing them together. Poirot stood near the hearth, the gramophone absent now, the mantel cleared save for the coffee cup that had sat there since the night of the death. He let them settle before he spoke. "There is a thing I have not told you," he began, his voice light but carrying. "The original record, the one Sir Charles intended to play, contained not only the accusations you have heard, it also contained a promise that the next day he would name names. It was this that frightened the guilty into acting. But there was one among you who did not need to fear the accusation itself, only the consequences of the codicil. That person did not alter the record, but they ensured that Sir Charles would not be alive to keep his promise." Richard looked away, his jaw tight. Lady Hawthorne's eyes remained fixed on Poirot. Vale's fingers tapped a silent rhythm on the arm of his chair. "The quarrel between father and son," Poirot continued, "was not about money alone. It was about what money signifies: control, independence, the right to direct the future. Sir Charles wished to bind that future to a new heir. Richard wished to preserve the old order, and in the heat of their argument, knowing the strain it placed upon his father's heart, Richard pressed too hard." Richard's voice, when it came, was low. "You make it sound deliberate." "It was deliberate in that you chose not to stop," Poirot said. "You are not guilty of premeditated murder, but of reckless disregard for a life you valued less than your own advantage. The law will call it what it will." He let that sink in before turning to Vale. "As for you, monsieur, you played your own game. You feared that Sir Charles might withdraw his patronage, that your debts and your reputation would not survive without his support. You heard enough of the original recording to know it would damage you. So you replaced it with another, one recorded in advance, perhaps at Sir Charles's request as a joke, but which served you well as a smokescreen. In doing so, you became the architect of confusion, though not of death." Vale made no reply, only sat back with a look that might have been defeat or calculation. Poirot's gaze moved lastly to Lady Hawthorne. "And you, madame, you feared scandal, not for yourself, but for the family name. You saw in Reed a loose thread, and sought to snip it before it could be pulled. The draft you sent was meant to frighten, not to kill, but it reveals the lengths to which you would go to preserve appearances. That is its own kind of guilt." For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then Miss Lydia gave a sharp, brittle laugh. "So we are all guilty, in our way. Very convenient." "Not convenient," Poirot said quietly. "I prefer one culprit to many. It is cleaner. But life, alas, is not always neat. Here, each of you helped in some measure to bring about the end of Sir Charles Hawthorne. You will each live with what you have done, or failed to prevent." Japp stepped forward then, his tone brisk, as though to clear the air. "That's enough for now. Vale, Richard, you'll come with me. Lady Hawthorne, you'll stay available for questioning. Miss Lydia, don't leave the county. And Reed—" He glanced toward the door, where the young man now stood pale but upright. "We'll be taking a statement from you once the doctor's cleared you." As Japp led Vale and Richard out, Poirot gathered his hat and gloves with unhurried precision. "It is finished, Hastings," he said softly. "No, not neat, but complete." Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the lawns in their full winter starkness. As we walked to the drive, I glanced back at the house, its windows catching the dull light. "You're right," I said. "It isn't neat, and I can't help thinking Sir Charles got what he wanted in a way. He set out to unmask them, and he did." even if it cost him his life. Poirot gave a small, melancholy smile. Perhaps that is the only satisfaction left to him. But remember, mon ami, truth is a dangerous performance. Sometimes the actors do not wait for the curtain to fall before they strike their final blow. We reached the car, and as Jap's motor started ahead of us, carrying away two of the players, the wind stirred the bare branches above, making a dry, whispering sound. It might have been the trees, or it might have been the echo of a gramophone voice, amused and certain, telling us once more what we already knew but had not wanted to hear. The solicitor arrived just before noon in a square-shouldered motor that looked as though it kept its own books. He was a compact gentleman named Carfax, with sandy lashes and the careful diction of one who has learned to move among families without leaving footprints. Graves showed him to the study. Poirot and I followed with the naturalness of men who have been expected all along. My instructions were to bring the draft only upon Mr. Hawthorne's personal request, Carfax began, placing a buff envelope on the desk with a small, respectful click. But given the circumstances, and Scotland Yard's presence, I think Sir Charles would have wished for clarity. Jap, appearing from the doorway with the air of a man who has been several places already this morning, gave a grunt that meant proceed. Carfax drew from the envelope two documents, a one-page codicil in Sir Charles's hand, and a shorter letter begun in the same script, and then interrupted. "The codicil leaves the lodge and 2 cottages in trust," Carfax said, "with an income attached, to my son, William Green, to be known henceforth as William Hawthorne Green. Those are the exact words. It reduces the main residuary bequest by half. The remainder stands as in the will." He tapped the second paper. "This letter is to the family. It explains the fact and requests that no rancour be shown to Mrs. Green or her boy. You see it was not finished." Poirot, who had not yet sat down, bent over the pages with a tenderness that might have been for a patient rather than a paper. "The signature is absent. The date is complete. You came yesterday?" Carfax shook his head. "He sent me word last week to prepare the language. Yesterday morning a second note arrived, asking me to attend this afternoon for execution and attestation. I found the note waiting when I returned from court. I did not come because—" His mouth compressed. "Because he was already dead." "Postmarked?" Jap asked. "Godalming, early post." Poirot's eyes had that narrow glitter, which is not unkindly, but is terribly exact. Godalming. Not the village doctor's surgery, then, though the young Monsieur Reed would have had us believe Sir Charles went there. So, the afternoon errand was to the solicitor by proxy, the morning, perhaps, to the carpenter, and to a thought. He straightened, and his gaze moved around the room once, as if it were a theatre he was measuring for light. "It is enough, I think. We lack only the small domestic proofs to satisfy the minds that love them." Carfax, who had the prudence to know when he had entered a story larger than his brief, bowed himself out with the papers returned to his care and the promise to place them with the court. We remained, 4 men and a gramophone that had already spoken too much for anything made of shellac, when another timid knock announced Reed. He was colourless still, but upright, with the look of a man who has passed a difficult night and found that the morning, for all its blunt light, is kinder than his imaginings. "I thought I should add something," he said, and the steadiness of his voice surprised me. "About the note to the solicitor. I posted it. Sir Charles gave it to me after luncheon and told me to send it from Godalming so the time would be sure. I told Mr. Poirot yesterday that Sir Charles went to the village. That was a lie. He stayed here. He was in the study almost all afternoon. I typed a memorandum for him, on my machine, and left him at 6. "On your machine," Poirot repeated gently. "And later, someone used your machine to make an anonymous letter to me." He took from his pocket the typewritten warning we had received. "You will not find what you are looking for. Sir Charles was not murdered. Let the matter rest." Reed's eyes flickered to the margin. That's my ribbon alignment. The E is faint, and the R prints a shade high. But I didn't write it. No, said Poirot. I do not think you did. But your door was not locked, and a woman who considers a secretary's place below stairs does not scruple to borrow his typewriter. He looked past Reed to the hall. Mademoiselle Lydia, will you spare us a moment? She came like a gust, spare, straight, affronted by the summons and by the necessity behind it. Poirot, all courtesy, indicated the chair and did not press her to sit. It is a small thing. You wrote to Mrs. Green last week with very firm words. The tone is the same here. He touched the anonymous note with a fingertip as if it might bruise. One wishes to quiet the pond, one throws a flat stone, not a heavy one. To me, it says, Aunt. You meant no harm. You intended to discourage the fuss. Miss Lydia drew herself even straighter. If I wrote anything, it was to protect this family from vulgarity. Exactement, said Poirot, with a little bow of agreement so exquisite it could not be mistaken for mockery. Though, in doing so, you dragged the vulgarity into daylight. It is a service, in its way. She did not answer, but when she left, her step was less certain than when she had entered. Reed remained, breathing more easily, as though some private exoneration had occurred. Courage, Poirot said to him in an undertone. You will be asked to tell the truth. You will tell it. It is sometimes unpleasant. It is never fatal. When he had gone, Japp leaned a hip against the desk. So we've got codicil motive proved, Vale's key found, the aunt's typed letter nailed to her, and the son's row fixed by time and witness. It will do. Crown'll like the picture. Poirot did not answer him at once. He had crossed to the bookcase that gave such an obliging mirror, and was considering in its glass the empty chair where Sir Charles had sat. There is also the noise, my friend. The noise. Graves's little truth. He told me, in passing, because a butler never presumes to have noticed what a detective needs, that at 8:40 he heard on this carpet, just here, the sound of a polished shoe sliding when an angry man stops short. It leaves a whisper in the pile. I saw its echo last night, the scuff that has not yet been brushed out. It is a trifle. It is enough. He made with his thumb a small arc in the air to show the very place. Sir Charles rose from his chair. The argument was at its height, and when Mr. Richard turned to go, he slipped a fraction. The heart that had been driven too fast stopped, in the pause before 9. It is one thing to hear a chain reasoned. It is another to feel a scene become present in the room. I could see the moment as clearly as if the gramophone had found a record of it. The air scored by words, the step halted, the silence that isn't silence at all, but the loudness of something ending. I swallowed. Poirot's gaze softened at once. Eh bien, Hastings, he said almost kindly, we will not make of the last breath a spectacle, even in the mind. We will make of it an understanding, and afterwards, order. The order began with tea. It always does, in England. Lady Hawthorne had taken to the morning-room, back very straight, hands precise about small tasks. Celia poured quietly, eyes lowered. Vale's place was empty, Richard's too. Miss Lydia's needles moved without sound. When Poirot entered, the temperature of the room did not change, but the air grew more honest. Madame, he said to Lady Hawthorne, I have asked the solicitor to remain. The codicil will be lodged as Sir Charles intended. It will not please you. It is, however, the will of the dead. You, who love the appearances, will honour the reality. It is better. For a long moment she looked at him. Then she inclined her head, not to him, I think, but to the fact. Mrs. Green will be told privately first, she said. There will be no announcements in the local papers until arrangements are proper. Her voice did not tremble. Only the slightest whiteness showed at the knuckles of the hand that held her teacup. Merci, said Poirot, as if she had offered him a kindness. He turned to Celia. And you, madame, give me back my mirror. She flushed and drew it from her pocket, with the air of a child confessing a mischief. I was foolish. I thought if I moved things in your room you might slow down. It is a natural desire, Poirot said, slipping the glass away. But you see, I do not go fast. I go only straight. There remained the small matter of the second anonymous note, the blocky scrawl thrust under the gate. He deserved what he got. I had wondered whose it might be. Poirot, it seemed, had wondered too, but without urgency. It solved itself after tea, when I encountered Richard in the corridor between Japp's room and the back stair, his face drawn, his hands raw-looking, where a man might bite his knuckles to keep from speaking. He held a scrap of paper he thought he had hidden. It bore the same impatient, disguised capitals, and a telltale smudge of the cheap village pencil, whose blue-black left its own blunt signature. He did not see me. I did not call out. Some admissions a man has already made to himself do not require Poirot's finger to press. By late afternoon, the house had settled into a new shape, as all houses do after a storm. Reed slept under the doctor's eye. Japp's men came and went with the quiet bustle of competence. A messenger was dispatched to Mrs. Green with a sealed note and a request. The hall clock ticked with the virtuous satisfaction of any mechanism restored to its proper purpose. Poirot, who had been everywhere and nowhere in particular, suggested a walk before the light went. We took the path along the ha-ha, where the mist, lifting, revealed a vista of hedges cut as straight as copybook lines. For several minutes we did not speak. The damp, the faintness of the old grass, the quick, dry flight of a wren from one bare thorn to another, all of it seemed part of a world that had no opinion on human folly. At last I said, "You are not satisfied, and yet you are." He smiled without looking at me. "I am like the English weather this morning, mon ami, grey with a little sun behind, satisfied with the pattern, not with the finish. But that, perhaps, is not given to us." "Sir Charles meant to name the thief, the coward, the fool," I said. "In the end, you named them for him." "Non," said Poirot. "I permitted them to take the names already written upon them. It is not the same." We turned back at the Folly, an absurd little temple whose columns had weathered themselves into a kind of melancholy. At the edge of the lawn we met Celia again, hatless, a ribbon of verbena on the air behind her. She stopped, brave in a way that had nothing to do with strength. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "do you think, will it be very bad for Richard?" "It will be as bad as truth and mercy combined can make it," he said. "I do not know yet what that is, but I will say this. You must not be the coward for him. He must do his own penance." She nodded once and went on. We watched her until the curve of the path hid her. Poirot sighed, very softly. "Now, Hastings," he said, brisk again, "we give to Japp the little neat parcels he adores. We will, after dinner, make the explanation, the one with the order and the list, so that each person has the label he has earned. It is not my favourite part, but it is necessary. And then—" his moustaches took on the upward tilt of contentment. "Then we go away. I have left a very good cake cooling on a shelf in London. It would be a crime to allow it to stale." We returned to the house as the first lamps were being lit, and the corridors took back their shadows. Somewhere a door closed with the modest certainty of a hand that knows its work. In the study, the gramophone stood already under its dust cover, retired from service like an actor turned to a quieter trade. I felt, very suddenly, a sympathy for it, a machine built to make voices louder, that had betrayed the living and the dead by doing only what it was meant to do. Poirot, catching the direction of my glance, patted the cover as one might a well-behaved dog. "Do not accuse the instruments, mon ami," he said. "They have no imagination. It is the imagination that kills and saves." He adjusted his tie, squared a paper on the desk so precisely you could have measured angels with it, and looked at the long case clock. The hands were on the point of the hour. "Come," he said, with that little smile that never fails to lift one's spirits, even when it is about a murder. "It is time to speak, and to make it so tidy that even Miss Lydia, in her heart, will be obliged to approve. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly, while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style." The family and those who remained were gathered in the drawing room after dinner, the hour late enough that the fire had sunk to a steady glow, and the shadows lay soft against the walls. Japp occupied his place by the door, the manner of a man both watchful and content to let someone else conduct the performance. Poirot stood by the mantel, his hands folded before him, and when the room had settled into expectant stillness, he began. "Mes amis, I will tell you the whole, as I have promised. Sir Charles Hawthorne, as you now know, intended a little theatre of truth. At 9 o'clock the gramophone would speak, and he would see which among you would betray themselves. He wished to name not only a crime, but a character, thief of trust, coward, fool. But his plan was itself a provocation, and in provoking, he woke the dangers he wished only to observe." He turned his gaze upon Richard, who met it with the air of one who has already been sentenced in his own mind. "You, monsieur, feared the codicil, feared the change it would bring to your inheritance and to the order of this house. You confronted your father here, in this very room, and pressed him, too hard, knowing his heart could not bear it. You did not strike him, you did not poison him, but you drove him past the point of safety. In law, it is culpable. In life, it is something you will carry always." Richard's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but he said nothing. Poirot's eyes moved to Simon Vale. "You, monsieur, heard part of the recording, enough to know that Sir Charles meant to accuse you of betrayal of trust. You feared ruin, the loss of your patronage, perhaps exposure of debts. So you used your access to the study, you had a key, to replace the original disc with one that contained only the macabre announcement of death. In doing so, you hid the warning that might have turned suspicion on you. You did not kill, but you obstructed the truth. The law will have its opinion of that." Vale gave a short, humourless laugh, but it faltered before the weight of silence that followed. Poirot turned to Lady Hawthorne. "And you, madame, whose life has been the guardianship of the family name, saw in young Mr. Reed a possible source of scandal, because he knew of the codicil, and because you feared what he might say. You sought to frighten him into silence, and in so doing you administered a draught that, though not fatal, was intended to weaken his resolve. That, too, is a form of guilt, though of a different colour." Lady Hawthorne's face did not change, but a faint tremor in her teacup betrayed her. "Miss Lydia," Poirot went on, "you wrote to Mrs. Green to warn her away, and you typed an anonymous note to me to dissuade my inquiries. You thought you were preserving propriety. Instead, you lit the lantern that showed us where to look." Miss Lydia's needles clicked once, then lay still in her lap. Poirot's gaze softened as it came to Celia. "And you, madame, you were the accident. At 20 minutes past 7, you entered this room in search of your bracelet and brushed the thread that released the gramophone brake. You set in motion the mechanism that would speak at 9, exactly as Sir Charles had planned. You did not know the danger you triggered, but later, when you suspected what it meant, fear made you act in small ways to protect yourself. That fear, I understand." Celia's eyes filled, but she held her chin high. "And so," Poirot concluded, "we have here not one murderer, but a house full of acts, each small in itself, yet together forming the pattern that ended Sir Charles's life and obscured the truth of it. No single hand wrote the whole, but each of you set your line upon the page." He stepped back, letting the weight of it settle. "For the law, there will be charges where the law finds them." "Fit, assistant. For the rest, the punishment will be to live with the knowledge of your part. Sir Charles, I think, would have approved of that, though not, perhaps, of the untidiness." Japp cleared his throat. "Well, that's about the size of it. I'll have statements from each of you. Some of you will be coming with me tonight. Others, the yard will be in touch with. Best you don't make plans to travel." As the room broke into subdued movement, chairs pushed back, skirts rustling, Poirot moved to the gramophone. He placed the dust cover over it with the care one might give to a relic, and for a moment stood with his hand resting on it. "To think," he murmured to me, "a machine built only to play a voice could speak so much more than its record contained." We left soon after, the lamps of the Grange receding into the mist behind us. In the motor, Poirot was quiet, his gaze turned to the dark lanes ahead. At last he said, "It was as I told you, Hastings. Truth is a dangerous performance. Sir Charles invited it upon his stage, and the actors gave him more than he asked for." He sat back, eyes closing briefly, then opened them with a little smile. "And now, mon ami, we return to London. There is a cake cooling, and I think we have earned it."